My name is Abebe Negash. I speak today on behalf of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace. This message is dedicated to the people of the Nile Basin, to farmers, families, children, and future generations in Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt, and across Africa whose lives depend on peace, water, dignity, and cooperation. What you are about to hear is not an attack on any nation, and it is not a political campaign. It is a truth-seeking dialogue. It is an effort to replace fear with facts, suspicion with understanding, and rivalry with shared responsibility. In this reading, we walk carefully through the full picture of the Nile issue as it stands in 2026. We will cover the historical roots of the dispute, including colonial-era treaties and why they are contested today, the legal principles of modern international water law, especially equitable and reasonable use, the technical realities of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, how it works, what it changes, and what it does not change. This topic also covers the environmental and hydrological concerns, including droughts, floods, sediment, irrigation, and data sharing. Questions of sovereign development rights and national dignities are also covered. And the role of international actors versus African-led solutions is also presented. The danger of military thinking and the catastrophic consequences war would bring to all sides also deeply discussed. The political narratives that shape public opinion in each country is also pointed out. And most importantly, the pathway towards cooperation, stability, and shared survival. This reading also reflects a deeper transition taking place across Africa, a movement away from dependency, proxy politics, and colonial-era frameworks toward sovereign African cooperation built on science, law, and mutual respect. We do not claim perfection. We do not claim that any side is without fear or legitimate concern. What we seek is balance, clarity, and the understanding that the Nile is not a weapon. It is a shared lifeline. As you listen, remember, peace is not weakness. Dialogue is not surrender. Truth is not an enemy. It is our hope that this full discussion helps open minds, reduce tension, and remind all of us that the future of the Nile must be built together, not through pressure, not through threats, but through wisdom. It is rather long dialogue, a mock dialogue, but let's begin. As we stand today in 2026, African Hearts for Peace and Ethiopian Hearts for Peace, we cannot bring the two nations together. So we present to you a mock dialogue between Egypt and Ethiopia. January 2026. Point 1. Water sovereignty versus colonial-era rights. Egyptian claim the Nile is Egypt's primary freshwater source and an existential threat if restricted. Egypt maintains that its mutual share of 55.5 billion cubic meters is untouchable, citing historical treaties of 1929 and 1959. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia rejects these outdated colonial-era agreements to which it was never a party. It asserts its sovereignty rights to utilize its natural resources for development, citing the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization. Truth checker. The 1959 agreement was between Egypt and Sudan and specifically excluded Ethiopia. Mind you, Ethiopia never been colonized. throughout history. While it excluded Ethiopia and other upstream states, modern international water law generally favors equitable use rather than unilateral historical vetoes. That's the truth. Point 2. Compensation for water loss. Egyptian claim. In January 2026, Egypt's water minister demanded compensation from Ethiopia, claiming the GERD has already denied Egypt access to 38 billion cubic waters of its water allocation. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia calls these claims malicious and baseless. It argues that the dam regulates seasonal floods and prevents historic destruction downstream, providing a more consistent water flow for Sudan and Egypt. Truth checker. As of 2026, there is no verified hydrological evidence showing a permanent 38 billion cubic meter reduction in Egypt's supply. Rather, the dam's reservoir holds up to 74 billion cubic meters, which was filled over several years, relying on winter rainfall in Ethiopian highlands. Point number 3. U.S. mediation and one-sided influence. Egyptian claim. Egypt welcomes the January 16, 2026 letter from Donald J. Trump, United States President, offering for the second time to restart mediation, viewing it as a path towards a legally binding agreement on water sharing. Ethiopian response is generally silence. Ethiopia has remained largely silent or muted regarding Trump's 2026 intervention. It previously rejected U.S. mediation as biased, preferring the African Union, AU, as the legitimate forum for dispute resolution. Truth checker. Trump's January 2026 letter to Al-Sisi, Egyptian president, and copied to other external states explicitly stated that no state should unilaterally control the precious resources of the Nile, a position that aligns closely with Egypt's security concerns. Point 4. Financing the dam. Egyptian claim. Trump statement. Donald J. Trump has repeated claims that the United States financed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia maintains the $5 billion project was largely self-funded through domestic contributions and national bonds. Truth checker. False. The GERD was primarily funded by the Ethiopian government and its citizens. The U.S. actually suspended approximately $272 million in aid to Ethiopia in 2020 to pressure them during negotiations. There is no record of the U.S. financing the dam's construction. Regardless, the dam is now complete. Let's continue to point 5. Point number 5. Binding versus non-binding agreements. Egyptian claim. Egypt demands a legally binding agreement that governs the filling and operation of the GERD during multi-year drought to ensure national security. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia offers non-binding guidelines or recommendations, arguing that a rigid legal treaty would infringe on its future development rights and water sovereignty. Truth checker. There is currently no international law mandating a legally binding treaty for dams. However, the 2015 Declaration of Principles, DOP, signed by both states, committed them to reach an agreement, though it left the legal nature ambiguous. Point number 6. Impact of drought years. Egyptian claim. During periods of low rainfall, Ethiopia must release specific volumes of water to prevent the Aswan High Dam from reaching critical dead storage levels. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia maintains it will coordinate releases but refuse to guarantee a specific volume, as it cannot control natural rainfall patterns or sacrifice its own power generation. Truth checker. Historical data shows that the Blue Nile provides approximately 85% of the Nile's flow. A sustained drought without a release protocol would significantly impact Egyptian hydroelectric output at Aswan. Point number 7. Safety and structural integrity. Egyptian claim. Egypt has raised concerns that the GERD's design may be structurally unsound, posing a catastrophic flood risk to Sudan and Egypt if the dam were to fail. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia asserts the dam is built to the highest international standards, verified by international consultants, and is the most scrutinized dam project in history. Truth checker. The International Panel of Experts, IPOE, reviewed the design in 2013 and recommended further studies, most of which Ethiopia claims to have addressed. No independent international body has declared the dam unsafe in 2026. Point number 8. Future upstream projects. Egyptian claim. Egypt argues that the GERD sets a dangerous precedent that would allow Ethiopia to build additional dams on the Blue Nile without prior consultation. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia maintains that as the resource of the water, it has a natural right to develop any infrastructure necessary to lift its 120 plus million citizens out of energy poverty. Truth checker. The Nile Basin Initiative, NBI, and the Cooperative Framework Agreement, CFA, promotes shared development, but Egypt and Sudan have historically refused to sign the CFA because it challenges their historic rights. Point 9. Environmental impact on the Nile Delta. Egyptian claim. The reduction in silt and sediment caused by the GERD will lead to increased erosion in the Nile Delta and decreased soil fertility for Egyptian farmers. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues that trapping silt behind the GERD actually extends the lifespan of dams in Sudan and Egypt by preventing them from clogging. Truth checker. Silt reduction is a standard byproduct of large dams. While it reduces downstream soil replenishment, it also reduces maintenance costs for irrigation, canals, and turbine damage. Number 10. Evaporation rates. Egyptian claim. The GERD reservoir, Lake Renaissance, loses billions of cubic meters of water annually to evaporate water that should have flowed to Egypt. By the way, Ethiopians call Blue Nile Abebe, and the lake that's created after the dam, Negat, as the Prime Minister called it at one point. Anyways, Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues that storing water in the cool, deep Ethiopian highlands results in less evaporation than storing it in the hot, shallow desert of Lake Nasser in Egypt. Truth checker. Hydrologically, water stored at high altitude, that is Ethiopia, evaporates at a slower rate than water stored in desert depressions, that's Egypt, potentially saving water on a basin-wide scale. 11. The role of the African Union, AU. Egyptian claim. Egypt views the African Union-led process as ineffective and stalled, preferring quartet mediation involving the US, EU, and UN. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia insists on African solutions to African problems, viewing Egypt's push for Western intervention as a tactic to exert geopolitical pressure. Truth checker. Since 2020, the African Union, AU, has moderated several rounds of talks with minimal progress. The deadlock is largely due to political disagreement rather than a lack of technical data. Point number 12. Historical versus natural rights. Egyptian claim. Egypt's rights are historical and acquired, established by centuries of continuous use and international recognition. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia advocates for natural rights, stating that those who live at the source of the water cannot be denied its use by those living at the end of the line. Truth checker. International water law. The 1997 UN Watercourse Convention does not recognize historical rights as a supreme. It balances them against the needs of other riparian states. Point number 13. Energy export versus local need. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia is building a prestige project to export power for profit while ignoring the water security of downstream neighbors. Ethiopian response. With over 60% of its population lacking electricity, the GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, is a survival necessity for domestic industry and basic lights. Truth checker. Ethiopia has already designed power purchase agreements with Kenya, Djibouti, and Sudan. While it will export power, the primary state goal is internal clarification. Some say there are data centers utilizing a huge amount of electricity, which generates a huge amount of revenue for the state of Ethiopia. Since Ethiopia is landlocked, its ability to import goods made from abroad is nearly impossible. Not by air, not by sea. So domestic production is a necessity to cover the restriction of imports, which politically and practically blamed on Egypt and other proxy parties. Point number 14. Water war rhetoric. Egyptian claim. Egypt has frequently hinted that all options are on the table, implying potential military action if its water supply is diminished by a single drop. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia views this as illegal saber-rattling and insists that any attempt to strike the dam would be met with full military defense. Truth checker. Military analysts generally agree that a kinetic strike on the dam would be a logistical nightmare and would result in catastrophic regional instability without solving the water sharing issues. That means all option on the table for Egypt is no good if it includes military strike. Point number 15. Data sharing transparency. Egyptian claim Ethiopia refuses to share real-time hydrological data, making it impossible for Egypt to plan its own agricultural cycles. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia claims it has shared sufficient data and that Egypt uses the technicalities to delay the project's operation. Truth checker. While some data exchange has occurred, a formal automated real-time data sharing protocol has not been finalized as of 2026. Point number 16. Impact on Sudanese farmers. Egyptian claim Egypt often speaks on behalf of Sudan, claiming the GERD will disrupt traditional flood recession agriculture along the Sudanese banks. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia point out that Sudan has often shifted its stance as the GERD offers Sudan consistent water flow and cheap electricity, mitigating flood risk. Truth checker. Sudan's position has fluctuated. While the dam prevents destructive floods, it does not require Sudanese farmers to change how they irrigate their land. Point number 17. Funding resources and foreign hand. Egyptian claim. Egypt alleges Ethiopia is being used by unnamed regional powers to weaken Egypt's regional standing. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia denies this, reiterating that the project is sovereign Ethiopian endeavor funding by its own people. Truth checker. There is no evidence of a foreign conspiracy, quote unquote. However, China has provided significant loans for the electrical infrastructure, turbines and lines, though not the dam wall itself. We have to see the infrastructure and the dam itself separate here. Point number 18. The gift of the Nile philosophy. Egyptian claim Egypt cites Herodotus. Egypt is a gift of the Nile to justify its external dependency on the river. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia responds that the Nile is a gift to all its children, including the 11 countries in the Basin. Truth checker. This is a philosophical disagreement. Egypt is 97% dependent on the Nile, whereas Ethiopia provides nearly all the water but historically used almost none of it. Point number 19. The 2024 to 2025 filling stages. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia completion of the final filling phase in late 2024 and 2025 was a unilateral breach of the 2015 Declaration of Principles. Ethiopia response is Ethiopia argues the filling is a natural consequence of construction progress and was necessary to test the turbines. Truth checker. The 2015 DOP states that the parties should agree on guidelines for filling parallel with construction. Because no agreement was reached, Ethiopia proceeded unilaterally. Point number 20. Trump's blow up the dam comment. Egyptian claim. Egypt uses Trump's 2020 and 2026 rhetoric to validate the idea that Ethiopia is the bad actor in the negotiations. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia condemned the comments as an incitement to war and a violation of diplomatic norms. Truth checker. In October 2020, Trump famously stated Egypt might blow up the dam. In 2026, his rhetoric remains heavily skewed toward Egyptian interests, often ignoring the Ethiopian developmental context. Mock dialogue continues. Egypt versus Ethiopia. Point 21 to 40. 21. The pre-existing rights doctrine. Egyptian claim. Egypt asserts that its agriculture and industry were built around a specific flaw that has existed for millennia, creating a prescriptive right under international custom. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues that prior use cannot be used to freeze development in other countries, as this would keep upstream nations in permanent poverty. Truth checker. International water law. UN 1997 Convention balances prior use against the potential for future use, meaning neither claim is absolute. Point 22. Point 22, rather. Impact on Aswan High Dam turbines. Egyptian claim. Lower water levels in Lake Nasser will reduce the hydraulic head, causing Egypt's own hydroelectric turbines to operate at lower efficiency or shut down entirely. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia suggests that the GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, will actually stabilize flow, allowing Egypt to manage its turbines more predictably throughout the year. Truth checker. If Lake Nasser drops below 147 meters, power generation at Aswan is significantly compromised. Coordination is required to prevent this. Underline this. If Lake Nasser drops below 147 meters, power generation at Aswan is significantly compromised. Therefore, coordination is required to prevent this with Ethiopia. 23. Point number 23. The double standard on dams. Egyptian claim. Egypt argues its own Aswan High Dam was necessary for survival, while Ethiopia's dam is unnecessarily large for its power needs. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia points out the hypocrisy of Egypt owning one of the world's largest dams while trying to prevent Ethiopia from building one. Truth checker. The GERD, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, is designed to produce 5,150 megawatts, making it the largest in Africa. Whether it is too large is a matter of engineering debate regarding turbine capacity versus flow. Point number 24. Climate change vulnerability. Egyptian claim. With rising temperatures, With rising temperatures and evaporation, Egypt cannot afford even a 1% reduction in water, as it is already below the water poverty line. Ethiopian response. Climate change will bring more intense rainfall to the Ethiopian highlands. The GERD acts as a buffer to protect the entire basin from extreme weather. Truth checker. Models suggest Nile flow may become more volatile. Both claims have merit. Ethiopia offers storage, but Egypt faces higher risk from any loss. Point 25. Groundwater alternatives. Ethiopian claim. Ethiopia argues Egypt has massive untapped aquifers, like the Nubian sandstone aquifer, and should rely more on those and desalination. Egyptian response. Egypt claims these sources are non-renewable or prohibitively expensive and cannot replace the volume provided by the Nile. Truth checker. Egypt is investing heavily in desalination plants and wastewater treatment, but these currently cover only a fraction of its total water needs. Point number 26. The 2015 Declaration of Principle, DOP, interpretation. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia violated Principle 5, agreement on filling, by filling the reservoir without a final deal. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia claims it followed Principle 3, preventing significant harm, and that filling is part of the construction process allowed by the DOP. Truth checker. The DOP is vaguely worded, allowing both sides to claim they are following the spirit of the law while interpreting the letter differently. Point 27. Irrigation versus power generation. Egyptian claim. Egypt fears Ethiopia will eventually divert water from the GERD for large-scale irrigation, permanently removing water from the river. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia insists the GERD is a hydropower only project. The water passes through the turbines and returns to the river. Truth checker. Currently, the GERD is designed for power. However, there are no legal guarantees preventing Ethiopia from building irrigation infrastructure upstream of the dam in the future. Point 28. Economic hegemony. Egyptian claim. Egypt believes Ethiopia aims to become the battery of Africa at the expense of Egypt's agricultural stability. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues that a prosperous, electrified Ethiopia is a better trade partner for Egypt than a poor, unstable one. Truth checker. Regional integration through the Eastern African Power Pool, EAPP, shows that shared energy can foster peace, but the water sharing foundation must be settled first. Point 29. Population growth pressure. Egyptian claims. With a population nearing 115 million, Egypt's demand is growing while supply remains static. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia's population is also exploding over 130 million, and it cannot remain a water tower that its own people cannot drink from it. Truth checker. Both countries face a Malthusian trap, where population growth is outpacing available water resource regarding of the dam. Point 30. The Trump deal validity. Egyptian claim. The deal, brokered by the U.S. Treasury in 2020 and revived in 2026, I would rather say U.S. President in both previous and current administration, is a fair compromise that Ethiopia walked away from. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia views that deal as a trap designed to favor Egypt and maintain colonial-era quotas under a different name. Truth checker. The 2020 U.S. brokered text was initialed by Egypt but rejected by Ethiopia, who claimed it was drafted without their final consent. Point 31. Environmental degradation of the Delta. Egyptian claim. Without the annual flush of the Nile, the Mediterranean Sea is encroaching on the Delta, salinating the soil. Ethiopian response. This is caused by rising sea levels and Egypt's own water management, not the GERD. Truth checker. Sea level rise is the primary driver of delta salination. Though reduced river pressure from the Nile can exacerbate the salt wedge intrusion. Point number 32. Third-party monitoring. Egyptian claim. Egypt demands international observers, US, EU, be stationed at the dam to verify water release delta. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia views this as a violation of its national sovereignty and neo-colonial surveillance. Truth checker. Independent monitoring is standard for transboundary rivers. Example, the Danube or Rhine. But it requires the consent of the host state, which Ethiopia disagree. 33. The Mandal Doctrine versus Nasser Doctrine. Ethiopian claim. Ethiopia cites the shift towards African liberation and shared resources. Egyptian response. Egypt cites its historical leadership and the need to protect its ancient civilization's lifeblood. Truth checker. This is a clash of political identities. Ethiopia as the rising Pan-African leader and Egypt as the established regional power. Point 34. Impact on Sudanese dams. Rosiers. Egyptian claim. The GERD will interfere with the operation of Sudan's Rosier Dam, located just 100 kilometers downstream. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues it will improve Rosiers by regulating the flow and preventing the sudden floods that often damage Sudan's infrastructure. Truth checker. In 2021, Sudan complained about lack of delta affecting Rosier. But by 2025, technical coordination between Ethiopian and Sudanese engineers has reportedly improved. Point 35. Urbanization and water waste. Ethiopian claim. Egypt wastes billions of cubic meters of water on insufficient flood irrigation and luxury desert cities like the new administrative capital. Egyptian response. Egypt is implementing a national plan to switch to drip irrigation and has some of the highest water reuse rates in the world. Truth checker. Egypt reuses drainage water multiple times. However, flood irrigation remains common in the delta due to the cost of conversion for small-scale farmers. Point 36. Tourism and cultural heritage. Egyptian claim. The Nile's flow is essential for the Nile cruise. industry, and the preservation of archaeological sites along the banks. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia's own heritage and right to exist through development outweighs the aesthetic or commercial needs of the tourism sector in Egypt. Truth checker. Significant drops in river levels would impact the navigability of the Nile for tourism, particularly between Luxor and Aswan. Point 37. The zero-sum game versus win-win. Egyptian claim. Any water Ethiopia keeps is water Egypt loses. It is a zero-sum calculation. Ethiopian response. It is a win-win because Ethiopia gets power and Egypt/Sudan get flood control and potential energy imports. Truth checker. In wet years, it is a win-win. In drought years, it becomes a zero-sum conflict without a robust sharing agreement. Point 38. Before this, robust sharing agreement depend on how it is presented. Binding versus non-binding, that was presented before. It's a no-no for Ethiopia as a matter of sovereignty. Point 38. Secret negotiations. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia is hiding the true scale of its future plans for the Blue Nile. Ethiopian response. Egypt uses its intelligence and diplomatic way to block Ethiopia's access to international loans and development funds. Truth checker. Both nations have engineered in extensive back-channel diplomacy. Egypt has successfully lobbied the World Bank to withhold direct funding for the GERD. Point 39. Legal standing of the 1902 Treaty. Egyptian claim. The 1902 Treaty between Britain, for Ethiopia, and Egypt forbids Ethiopia from building anything that arrests the flow of the Nile. Ethiopian response. The Amharic version of the 1902 treaty differs from the English version, and regardless, a treaty signed by colonial power is not binding on a modern state. Mind you, Ethiopia never been colonized by either English or any other superpowers in the past. So, truth checker. Discrepancies between the English and Amharic texts of 1902 are well documented. Ethiopia has consistently maintained the treaty is null and void. Point number 40. The 2026 Trump payback allegation. Ethiopian claim. Trump's current 2026 support for Egypt is payment for Egypt's diplomatic alignment with the U.S. on Middle Eastern issues. Egyptian response. Egypt is a strategic U.S. ally, and the U.S. is simply protecting regional stability and international law. Truth checker. Geopolitics heavily influence the mediation. Egypt's role in Mediterranean and Middle East security makes it a vital ally for any U.S. administration, often resulting in favorable diplomatic leaning in the Nile disputes. Please hold on as we continue this mock dialogue between Egypt and Ethiopia. Point 41 to 60 continue. Point 41. Blue Nile tributary control. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia is planning smaller dams on the Tana and Basin River that feed the Blue Nile, which will further decrease the total volume reaching the GERD and Egypt. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia maintains that all internal water projects are part of its national master plan and are necessary for decentralized rural development. Truth checker. Ethiopia has several small hydro and irrigation projects planned, while the GERD is the largest. The cumulative effect of upstream microdams is a valid hydrological concern for downstream flow stability. Point 42. The virtual water argument. Ethiopian claim. Egypt imports massive amounts of virtual water through subsidized food imports, wheat/meat. While Ethiopia is forced to use its own water to grow food it cannot afford to import. Mind you, Ethiopia is being encircled by Egypt in current geopolitical alliance in the Horn of Africa and Red Sea. Egyptian response. Importing food is a survival strategy, not a luxury. It does not negate Egypt's legal rights to the physical water of the Nile. Truth checker. Egypt is the world's largest wheat importer economically. Virtual water helps water-scarce nations, but it creates a dangerous dependency on global market prices. Point number 43. Seismic activity and dam failure. Egyptian claim. The East African Rift is seismically active. A major earthquake could cause the GERD to fail, sending a wall of water that would submerge Khartoum and destroy the Aswan Dam. Ethiopian response. The GERD is a roller, compacted concrete, RCC, gravity dam, which is inherently resistant to seismic shifts. The design accounts for the highest possible regional seismic risks. Truth checker. While the region is seismically active, gravity dams are considered the safest against the earthquakes. However, the sheer volume of 74 billion cubic meters make any structural risk a higher consequence event. Point 44. Rights of the riparian majority. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia points out that the majority of the 11 Nile Basin countries support the Cooperative Framework Agreement, CFA, which Egypt continues to block. Egyptian claim. A majority vote cannot strip a country of its existential water rights. Egypt only rejects the CFA because it removes the requirement for prior consent. Truth checker. As of 2026, the CFA has been ratified by several states, including Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Tanzania, challenging the 1959-based legal order. Point 45. Evaporative savings versus loss. Ethiopian claim. By storing water in the cool Ethiopian highlands, the GERD reduces the need for Egypt to store excessive amount in the scorching Sahara, Lake Nasser, theoretically saving 5 billion cubic meters annually. Egyptian response. Egypt cannot rely on Ethiopia's savings because it loses physical control over when that water is released. Truth checker. Physics supports Ethiopia's claim that high-altitude storage reduces evaporation. However, without a joint management agreement, Egypt cannot bank on those savings. Again, coordination. Point number 46. Technical committee deadlocks. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia has intentionally sabotaged the National Independent Scientific Research Group, NISRG, by refusing to provide raw hydrological data. Ethiopian response. The group was meant to be advisory, but Egypt tried to turn it into a veto board to halt construction. Truth checker. The NISRG has met dozens of times since 2018. Most sessions ended in a stalemate over the baseline flow figures. Point 47. Impact on fish stocks and biodiversity. Egyptian claim. The dam will disrupt the migration of fish and the nutrient cycle, devastating the fish industry in the Nile and the Mediterranean. Ethiopian response. The GERD creates a massive new reservoir, Lake Renaissance, which will provide a new, sustainable fishing industry for the region. Truth checker. Damming always alters local biodiversity. While it may harm some riverine species, it creates a new habitat for lacustrine or lake fish. Point 48. The sovereign debate, or the sovereign debit pressure. I apologize, let me read it. The sovereign debit pressure. Egyptian claim. Ethiopia is rushing the dam's operation because it is under massive pressure to repay Chinese loans and stabilize its economy. Ethiopian response. The dam is an investment, not a debit trap. The faster it generates power, the faster Ethiopia becomes economically independent. Truth checker. Ethiopia's debt to GDP ratio has been a concern for the IMF. The World Bank notes that energy exports are a key part of Ethiopia's debt sustainability strategy. Point 49. Prior notification. Obligations. Egyptian claim. Under international law, Ethiopia must provide prior notification of any project that might affect downstream states. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia notified Egypt of the project in 2011 and has participated in 15 years of talks. Notification does not mean permission. Truth checker. The 1997 UN Convention requires notification and consultation. Ethiopia argues it has fulfilled this. Egypt argues the consultation was not in good faith. Point number 50. Use of water as a political weapon. Egyptian claim. Egypt fears that once Ethiopia controls the tap, it will use water to dictate Egyptian foreign policy or demand concessions on other regional issues. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia has never used its resources as a weapon and views this as a projection of Egypt's own past hydro hegemony. Truth checker. There is no historical precedent for Ethiopia using water as a weapon, but the physical capacity to restrict flow during a drought creates an inherent power balance. 51.51. The Aswan Dam storage trigger. Egyptian claim. If the Aswan High Dam falls below 147 meters, the turbines stop. Egypt wants a guarantee that GERD will release water before this happens. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia cannot be held responsible for the Aswan Dam levels, which are also affected by Egypt's own irrigation withdrawals. Truth checker. This is the core of the technical dispute. Egypt wants a release trigger based on its own reservoir levels, which Ethiopia views as an infringement on its operational autonomy. Point 52. Domestic political destruction. Egyptian claim. The Ethiopian government uses the GERD to wipe up nationalism and distract from internal ethnic conflicts and civil unrest. Ethiopian response. The Egyptian government uses the water threat to justify military spending and suppress domestic dissent by creating an external enemy. Truth checker. Both governments have used the Nile issue to foster national unity during the time of internal political stress. Point 53. Navigation in the main Nile. Egyptian claim. Lower water levels make the Nile unnavigable for the transport of goods and fuel between Sudanese and Egyptian cities. Ethiopian response. A regulated flow from the GERD actually makes the river more navigable year-round by eliminating the dry season lows. Truth checker. A regulated flow generally aids navigation. However, during the filling phase, level did drop enough to cause temporary navigation issues in Sudan, which needs also verification. Point number 54. Groundwater salinity in the delta. Egyptian claim. Reduced freshwater pressure allows seawater to dip into the undergoing aquifer of the Nile Delta, ruining the drinking water of millions. Ethiopian response. This is a result of Egypt over-pumping its own groundwater, not the dam, 3,000 miles away. Truth checker. It is a combination of both. Reduced river flow decreases the hydraulic barrier that keeps the sea out, but over-extraction by Egypt accelerates the process. 55.55. The White Nile fallacy. Ethiopian claim. Egypt gets water from the White Nile via Uganda, South Sudan, which is not affected by the GERD. Therefore, the Blue Nile scare is exaggerated. Egyptian response. The White Nile provides only 15% of the total flow. The Blue Nile, Ethiopia, provides 85%. You cannot replace the heart of the river with a minor artery. Truth checker. Correct. The Blue Nile is the primary source of the Nile, annual flood, and the majority of its volume. Point 56. The role of the Arab League. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia rejects the interference of the Arab League, stating that the Nile is an African river, not an Arab one. Egyptian claim. Egypt is a founding member of the Arab League, and its water security is a matter of Arab national security. Truth checker. The Arab League has repeatedly passed a resolution supporting Egypt, which has historically alienated Ethiopia and other sub-Saharan African states. Essentially, Egypt stands against African Union and Pan-Africanism, where Ethiopia is strong. Egypt is in the North Africa geographically. So if it identifies itself as an Arab, not African, that need to be verified. Point number 57. Future purchase of water. Ethiopian claim. In the future, water would be treated as a commodity. If Egypt wants more than its equitable share, it should pay for it. Egyptian response. Selling water is a violation of international norms and the human rights to water. Truth checker. International law generally treats water as a public good, but water markets exist in some regions like Australia. There is no current legal basis for Ethiopia to sell Nile water, nor prohibit Ethiopia from commodifying water. After all, its source is in Ethiopia. By sovereignty, Ethiopia owns its own resources, and water is one of them, like mineral and other things, it can be sold. That is the truth checker. Point 58. Siltation and dam lifespan. Ethiopian claim, by trapping silt, the GERD will have Egypt and Sudan millions of dollars in annual dredging costs. Egyptian response, that silt is the blood of Egyptian agriculture. Without it, we must use expensive chemical fertilizers that pollute the soil. Truth checker. Modern Egyptian agriculture already relies heavily on chemical fertilizers because the Aswan High Dam has been trapping silt since the 1960s. The GERD will not change this significantly for Egypt, but it will help Sudan. In truth checking, the argument is the silk that is being carried to Egypt and Sudan from Ethiopia carries minerals and soil, which in a sense can be commodified. But to make the matter less complex, let's move on to point 59. Emergency release protocols. Egyptian claim, Ethiopia has no transparent plan for emergency release during the technical failures of extreme floods. Ethiopian response, Ethiopia has built in a spillway and outlet works capable of handling the probable maximum flood. Truth checker, the GERD features massive spillway systems. The dispute is not about the capability to release water, but the legal obligation to do so. Point 60. The 2026 Trump deal and colonialism. Ethiopian claim, the U.S. pressure in 2026 feels like the 1884 Berlin Conference, where African resources were carved up by outsiders for the benefit of their favorites. Egyptian response, the U.S. is simply acting as a guarantor of peace to prevent a war that would destroy the Horn of Africa. Truth checker, the perception of one-sidedness in U.S. mediation has been a major diplomatic hurdle. Ethiopia's characterization of the 2026 intervention as neo-colonial echoes its historical stance against the 1902 and 1929 treaties. Again, my name is Abebe Negash on behalf of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace. This is a mock dialogue between Egypt and Ethiopia. Continuation, point 61 to 100. To provide the most comprehensive overview for our mock dialogue, these points summarize the remaining technical, legal, and geopolitical contentions and the dispute as they stand in 2026. Point 61 to 70. All technical and engineering disagreements. Egyptian claim. Egypt argues that Ethiopia's turbine testing phase in 2025 to 2026 were conducted without warning, causing sudden water level fluctuations that disrupted Egyptian pumping stations. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia asserts that turbine testing is a standard industrial procedure and that the volume of water used is negligible compared to the total Nile flow. Truth checker. Sudden changes in flow can affect downstream lift irrigation pumps. However, as of 2026, satellite monitoring provides enough lead time for downstream states to adjust, making surprise fluctuations less likely than in previous years. Point 71 to 80. Legal and treaty interpretation. Egyptian claim. Egypt insists that the 1959 agreement is a foundational document of regional law that Ethiopia must respect to ensure order. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia viewed the 1959 agreement as a monopoly pact that divided 100% of the water between two countries, Egypt and Sudan, while ignoring the source country, which is Ethiopia. Truth checker. Under the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, a treaty cannot impose obligations on a third party, Ethiopia, without its consent. Therefore, the 1959 treaty is not legally binding on Ethiopia. Point 81 to 90. Geopolitical alliances and mediation. Egyptian claim. Egypt asserts that the United States, under the Trump administration in 2026, is the only mediator with the clout to force a fair deal. Ethiopian response. Ethiopia argues that the U.S. is biased due to its strategic partnership with Egypt and prefers the African Union to maintain African sovereignty over African resources. Truth checker. The U.S. has a historical, special relationship with Egypt, providing billions in military aid. This has led to a perception, verified by Trump's 2026 letters, that the U.S. views the Nile primarily through the lens of Egyptian security. Point 91 to 100. Resource management and future outlook. Ethiopian claim. Ethiopia argues that Egypt should focus on desalination and crop switching, moving away from thirst crops like rice and sugarcane, instead of blaming the GERD. Egyptian response. Egypt is already a world leader in water recycling, but no amount of technology can replace the 55.5 billion cubic meters it needs to survive. Truth checker. Egypt has invested over 50 billion in its National Water Plan 2037, including the world's largest wastewater treatment plants. While Egypt is becoming more efficient, the Nile remains its only viable source for large-scale caloric production. Thank you very much. Now let's go over summary truth checker. The Trump financing claim. Donald J. Trump states or implied in 2026 that the United States financed the GERD. Truth. This is completely false. Here we have reasons. Let's give you 3 of them. 1. Funding source. The GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, was funded by the Ethiopian people through salary contributions, national lotteries, and government bonds after international banks, under pressure from Egypt, refused to lend, including the IMF, World Bank, including United States itself. Point number 2. U.S. action. Far from financing it, the U.S. cut aid to Ethiopia in 2020, approximately $272 million US dollars, specifically because Ethiopia refused to sign a U.S. drafted deal that favored Egypt. Point number 3. 2026 context. Any claim by the U.S. administration in 2026 regarding financing the dam is a factual error or political misrepresentation of historical U.S. aid, which was actually humanitarian and unrelated to the dam's consumption. This is for informational purpose only, brothers and sisters. For any advice or diagnosis, we need to consult I'm sorry, I misread it. This is for informational purpose and it is a mock interview. Now, let's go to the next segment. As an advisor to the Ethiopian authorities in 2026, the strategy can shift away from defending the dam, which is now completed reality, towards a winning statement rooted in post-colonial justice and modern hydrological reality. Here is the winner statement. The winner statement is not a plea for permission, but an assertion of a new regional order. Here is the winner statement of 2026. The era of hydro hegemony ended with the first turn of the GERD turbines. Ethiopia has not taken Egypt's water. We have merely ended the era where Ethiopia's poverty was a requirement for Egypt's security. We offer Egypt a partnership based on 21st century science, where the Nile is managed as a shared African asset, rather than 19th century colonial maps that attempted to erase the existence of the 120 plus millions people living at the river source in Ethiopia. We have identified 5 indefensible arguments against Egyptian claims too. 1. The colonial ghost argument. The argument, Egypt's reliance on the 1929 and 1959 treaties is legally and morally indefensible. These treaties were designed by colonial powers, Britain, to secure their own interest in the Suez Canal and Egyptian cotton. Here is a win. International law, the tabula rasa or clean slate doctrine, dictates that newly independent states are not bound by colonial treaties they did not sign. By insisting on these treaties, Egypt is asking the world to uphold the legacy of the British Empire over African sovereignty. Number 2, the physics of evaporation argument. The argument, it is scientifically indefensible to insist on storing water in Lake Nasser, a shallow desert basin with some of the highest evaporation rates on Earth, while opposing storage in the Ethiopian highlands, a deep, cool reservoir. Here is a win. Ethiopia is actually saving the Nile Basin billions of cubic meters of water annually by preventing it from evaporating into the Sahara. To oppose the GERD is to support the waste of water through heat. Number 3, the equitable use versus absolute rights argument. The argument, Egypt claims an absolute right to a specific volume, 55.5 billion cubic meter. Under modern international water law, the 1997 UN Convention, no state has an absolute right to a volume. They only have a right to equitable and reasonable utilization. Here is a win. Ethiopia contributes 86% of the water, but historically used 0%. Egypt contributes 0%, but claims 100% of the allocated flow. No international court or objective mediator can define 100% versus 0% as equitable. Equitable. Number 4, the internal efficiency argument. The argument, Egypt's existential threat claim, is weakened by its own internal water management. Egypt continues to use flood irrigation, the last efficient method, and allocates water to desert, vanity projects like the new administrative capital. Here's a win. Ethiopia cannot be expected to remain in darkness and poverty to subsidize inefficient water use downstream. The threat is not the GERD. The threat is the lack of modern irrigation and desalination infrastructure in Egypt. Number 5, the sovereign funding argument, countering Trump/US pressure. The argument: Egypt and the US claim the right to dictate terms on a project they did not fund. Here is a win. Because the GERD was funded by the nickels and dimes of the Ethiopian people after the US and World Bank and the IMF blocked loans, Ethiopia owes no creditor's debt or diplomatic veto to any outside power. The dam is 100% Ethiopian property. Therefore, the terms of its operations are a matter of Ethiopian sovereignty, not American or Egyptian decree, not Arab League, not any other nation. So we went back and fed this to truth checker for the advisor's position. Claim: Ethiopia saved the water from evaporation. Truth: scientific fact. Hydrological status confirms that the dead storage and evaporation at Aswan, Lake Nasser, are significantly higher due to the surface area to volume ratio and the extreme Saharan climate compared to the Ethiopian highlands. Claim: colonial treaties did not bind Ethiopia. Truth: legal fact. Ethiopia was never a party to the 1929 or 1959 agreements. Under the Nile Doctrine, successor states in Africa have the right to revoke colonial-era agreements that do not serve their national interest. So, if Egypt's current strategy of encirclement and diplomatic pressure is failing to stop the GERD, which is now an operational reality in 2026, the most effective winning strategy for Egypt is a strategic pivot from confrontation over volume to integration over benefit. To achieve cooperation that is scientific, philosophical, and truth-anchored, Egypt should adopt the following strategies. I am proudly present Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace the following. 1. Philosophical shift from water rights to water security. The concept: Egypt currently argues from historic rights, static versus / legalistic. It should pivot to water security, which is dynamic and practical. The strategy is this: instead of demanding 55.5 billion cubic meter, a number that Ethiopia does not recognize, Egypt should propose a guaranteed minimum flow linked to hydrological cycles. The truth anchor, though, acknowledging that the Nile's flow is not a mixed number, but a variable natural process, allows Egypt to appear reasonable and scientific, making it harder for Ethiopia to refuse cooperation during dry season or dry years. While this is in motion, let's take a look at the scientific strategy, the delta for energy trade. Here is the concept. Ethiopia needs to sell the electricity generated by the GERD to make the project profitable. Egypt is the largest potential market and gateway to the Mediterranean energy grid. The strategy is this: Egypt should offer to buy massive amount of Ethiopian electricity at the minimum price or negotiated price, but only under the condition of a joint technical management office located at the dam. Here is the truth. anchor. The truth anchor says this. This creates a mutual hostage situation. Ethiopia gets the revenue it needs for development. Egypt gets eyes on the dam and real-time data to manage its own as one high dam. This gives scientific transparency, becomes a byproduct of economic necessity. If that is that, then let's go to regional integration. The Nile Basin Economic Zone. Here is a concept. Stop treating the Nile as a source of conflict and start treating the entire basin as a single economic unit. The strategy is simple. Instead of trying to encircle Ethiopia by making enemies of its neighbors, like Sudan, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Egypt should lead the creation of a Nile Basin Power and Water Authority. Egypt should and could provide the technology for high efficiency drip irrigation to Ethiopia and Sudan in exchange for water release guarantees. Here is the truth anchor. You might like it or might not like it. It's okay. But the truth anchor, it is scientifically proven that the basin produces enough water for everyone if it is used efficiently. Ethiopia is planting plenty of plants bringing rain to the highlands. And if you add Egypt's current flood irrigation wastes more water than the GERD reservoir holds, and then helping upstream neighbors save water effectively creates more water for Egypt. So why don't you help Ethiopia forest get bigger in preventing Sahara Desert expansion? So in all, there has to be a media and diplomatic pivot. The responsible elder narrative is as follows. As a part of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace, we present to you the concept. In 2026, the world views Egypt's all option on the table rhetoric as destabilizing. The strategy should be Egypt should position itself as the responsible elder of the Nile. Instead of lobbying the US to stop the dam, it should lobby the World Bank and the African Union to fund basin-wide drought insurance. The truth anchor. Drought is the real enemy, not the dam. By focusing on a drought protocol, like preventing Sahara expansion, signed by all 11 Nile states, Egypt can secure its water during the only time it is actually at risk, without challenging Ethiopia's sovereignty, rights to generate power. So here we present to you the truth-anchored truth checker for Egypt's new strategy. Current tactic. Truth-anchored alternative and why it wins. We will present to you. Encirclement, saber rattling is regional investment. Military action cannot bring water. Investment creates a legal and economic seat at the table. Colonial treaties are legally weak. If you claim colonial rights, claim human rights. The rights to water for 115 million people of Egypt is an internationally recognized human right. You cannot undo the dam. You can, however, integrate it into the Aswan High Dam's operation to create a two-dam cascade system. So opposing the GERD is not good. Optimizing the GERD is good. Why don't you be the part of it? So the winning statement for Egypt 2026 is this: Egypt no longer asks Ethiopia to stop its development. We ask Ethiopia to join us in a Nile Solidarity Pact. We will be your biggest customer for energy, and you will be our partners in water conservation. Let us manage the river based on the rain that falls today, not the treaties signed 100 years ago. Our survival is linked. If the GERD fails, Sudan and Egypt are destroyed. If Egypt's economy collapses, Ethiopia loses its best customer in selling electricity. We choose a shared future over a shared catastrophe. In conclusion, Egypt can go on. For Egypt to win, it must stop fighting the existence of the dam and start fighting for the joint management of the water by moving from a zero-sum mindset to a benefit-sharing mindset. Egypt removes Ethiopia's ability to frame the dispute as a struggle against neocolonialism. In 2026, the distinction between joint management and joint operation is the real line of the negotiation. To teach a breakthrough that satisfies both sides, the strategy must evolve from a rigid binding treaty towards a binding technical framework. 1. Joint management versus joint operation. Joint operation, Ethiopia's sphere, this implies Egypt having a hand on the control switch of the dam. Ethiopia will never accept this, as it views the GERD as a sovereign strategic asset. Whereas joint management, the solution, this involves a shared data and coordination office. It does not tell Ethiopia when to turn on the turbines, but it mandates that Ethiopia must notify Egypt of the flow volume 48 to 72 hours in advance, so Egypt can adjust the Aswan High Dam accordingly. 2. Binding or non-binding. The hybrid approach is what we propose. The 15-year deadlock has been caused by Egypt demanding a binding treaty, legal/political, and Ethiopia offering non-binding guidelines, technical/voluntary. The 2026 winning strategy, a binding technical protocol with a dynamic dispute resolution clause. Why it works for Egypt? It is binding in that it creates a legal obligation for Ethiopia to release specific volumes during defined drought years. Why it works for Ethiopia? It is technical rather than political. It does not define water shares, which would feel like a colonial treaty, but rather defines operational safety standards. 3. The scientific truth checker, the cascade concept. See, mathematically and hydrologically, the Nile is now a cascade system. The GERD is the upper reservoir. The Aswan High Dam, HD, is the lower reservoir. The truth: if these two dams are managed independently, they both lose efficiency. If they are managed as a single system, joint management, the basin can withstand a 3-year drought without either country losing significant power or irrigation water. 4. The philosophical pivot for 2026. Egypt must stop asking for a water treaty and start asking for a drought management agreement. In normal and wet years, no binding rules. Ethiopia operates freely to maximize power. In dry or drought years, binding protocols trigger a mandatory release from the GERD to prevent the AHD from hitting dead storage. So we have this summary table, the cooperation framework table. It has the future old Egyptian demand followed by the 2026 strategy or cooperation. The legal nature, which is the future, legally binding treaty is the old, and the new 2026 strategy is binding technical protocol. Same thing can be said for water focus. The old is fixed on annual share, 55.5 billion cubic meter, forget it, and go on to variable drought release targets. And then you have this authority, which they say in the old days, international arbitration, forget it. Joint Nile Basin Commission, regional. You see, the other authority is the United States / world. Forget all of that. Go to African Union. Unless Egypt says otherwise, not African. Which is risky there. Mediation, bank pressure. Technical experts need to be involved in that. So the bottom line, for Egypt to win in 2026, it must accept that Ethiopia owns the dam, while Ethiopia must accept that Egypt owns a right to the data. A binding agreement on data and drought is achievable. A binding agreement on ownership and quota is not. Again, I repeat this. For Egypt to win in 2026, it must accept that Ethiopia owns the dam, while Ethiopia must accept that Egypt owns a right to the data. A binding agreement on data and drought is achievable. A, in quote, binding, unquote, agreement on ownership and quotas is not. We have looked at several sources for this. 1. The Nile Basin Initiative, Strategic Plan 2026. 2. We looked at International Water Management Institute, GERD Coordination Report. 3. The United Nations Watercourses Convention, 1997, Article 7, obligation not to cause significant harm. 4. African Union, Office of the Legal Council on GERD Mediation. 5. We looked at Journal of Hydrology, Cascade Operation of GERD and AHD. 6. Egyptian Ministry of Water Resources, National Water Plan 2037. 7. Ethiopian Ministry of Water and Energy, GERD Operational Guidelines 2025-2026. So, to address the profound historical and geopolitical concerns, we have raised from an African Hearts for Peace perspective, here is a truth-anchored analysis of the shift from the colonial proxy mindset to a sovereign African future in 2026. Bear with us, although it is very long and complex, but simple. 1. The African identity paradox. The issue is Egypt's historical reliance on non-African alliances, the US, Gulf states, Europe, to exert pressure on Ethiopia is viewed by many as a betrayal of Pan-Africanism. When we do the true check, since the 1950s, Egypt's foreign policy has often prioritized its identity as a Mediterranean and Arab power over its identity as an African one. However, in 2026, the African Union, AU, has become the primary arbiter of the GERD dispute, signaling a shift. Ethiopia's insistence on African solutions for African problems is legally supported by the African Union Charter, which emphasizes territorial integrity and sovereign resource rights. 2. The sovereignty and coastal access dispute. The issue, the 1993 independence of Eritrea and the subsequent landlocking of Ethiopia is often attributed to Egyptian and foreign strategic interests aimed at weakening Ethiopia. Truth checker. While Eritrea's independence was the result of a 30-year war and a 1993 referendum voted on only by Eritreans, geopolitical analysts agree that Egypt has historically maintained close ties with Eritrea and Somalia to encircle Ethiopia. In 2026, Ethiopia's push for a port via the Memorandum of Understanding (MOU) with Somaliland has heightened these tensions, with Egypt siding with the Mogadishu government to maintain the status quo. Egypt never helped Mogadishu government stand on its feet since Somalia was fragmented as a state. Ethiopia did. 3. The weaponization of instability. The issue. Destabilizing Ethiopia via proxies, TPLF, Eritrea, or others now active in the country, prevents the very scientific cooperation, meteorological data, flood prediction, and so on. Egypt needs to manage its own water. Therefore, in our truth checker, this is an indefensible tactical error. Hydrologists confirm that for Egypt to survive droughts, it needs Ethiopia to be stable and functional. If Ethiopia is in conflict, data sharing stops. In 2026, the GERD is full. If a massive flood occurs and there is no coordination due to proxy wars, Sudan and Egypt face catastrophic uncontrolled releases. 4. The petrodollar and lobbying influence. Here is the issue. Egypt's use of expensive U.S. lobbying and Gulf state influence, investment in Ethiopian land, is seen as a 21st century form of neocolonialism. Truth checker. It is a fact that Egypt spent millions on lobbying in Washington during the Trump administration to secure the one-sided letter mentioned earlier. However, the truth of 2026 is that water cannot be lobbied. No amount of money in DC or Riyadh can change the physical flow of the Blue Nile or the fact that Ethiopia holds the headwaters. 5. The myth of military conquest. The issue is this. Egypt cannot win a direct or proxy war against Ethiopia. It says all options on the table. Easy to say. Given Ethiopia's history of resisting superpowers and Adwa and etc., we checked the truth. Military experts in 2026 concur. Ethiopia's terrain and the sheer scale of the GERD, a gravity dam, make it nearly impossible to destroy without causing a regional tsunami that would destroy Sudan and Egypt's own Aswan Dam. A war is a mutual suicide pact. That's the truth we found out. So we have a winning recommendations for peace in 2026. To avoid the catastrophic end we described, Egypt must undergo a radical diplomatic evolution. 1. De-internationalize the dispute. Egypt must stop taking the Nile to the UN Security Council or the US White House. It must return to the the African Union as the humble member, not a strategic or a regional hegemony. 2. Disarm the proxy strategy. Egypt must realize that a fragmented Ethiopia is a hydrological nightmare. A stable Ethiopia is the only entity that can guarantee a steady flow of water during a drought. 3. Accepting the post-colonial map, Egypt must stop citing 1929, 1959 endlessly. It should instead champion the Nile Basin Initiative vision of shared prosperity. 4. Exchange for ports for water support. A grand African bargain could involve Egypt supporting Ethiopia's legitimate quest for stable sea access in exchange for binding drought management protocol. Again, another final truth check. The national will claim the dam is the national dam and nobody will give the right of sovereignty that easy. When we verified this truth, the GERD is unique because it was funded by internal Ethiopian bonds. There is no foreign debt to leverage against Ethiopia. This makes the dam a symbol of Ethiopian dignity that no government in Addis Ababa can negotiate away without facing internal collapse. You can support any power-hungry factions, armed factions in Ethiopia to topple governments, but in the end, Ethiopia's dignity will plunge. So the verdict for 2026, Egypt's colonial mentality is its greatest obstacle to water security. By treating Ethiopia as an enemy, it ensures that in a future drought, Ethiopia will have no incentive and no functional state capacity to help Egypt survive. Cooperation is not a favor to Ethiopia. It is Egypt's only path to survival. Thank you very much for staying with us. We discussed this for 1 hour and 41 minutes. And we gathered all the facts the best we could. And this is Abebe Negash on behalf of Ethiopian Hearts for Peace and African Hearts for Peace. Thank you.